We're just delighted to have you here this morning and have you be a part of our worship service. Among our guests, we have brothers with us this morning from the church in River Chase. They're outside of Birmingham, and they are part of our group that will be going to Baja, Mexico here in a couple of weeks. We're very excited about this upcoming trip, and I was sharing with them a little bit earlier that our numbers were down a little bit because the Moulton Church was not able to send anybody in person this go-around, but that's been replaced by the brethren from River Chase. And so the Lord always makes provision, and such is the case with our upcoming trip. And while you're praying about various and sundry things, let me give you a current one that's ongoing. Last night, Tim, I can go ahead and tell this now because you're off the hook. But last night, Tim Nichols took a truck loaded down with supplies for this upcoming trip. It's a very special vehicle. It was a truck that belonged to McRae Benefield, and Kim and the family have donated that to the Baja work, and we're very excited about that because a part of him will be there for years to come, because I'll assure you they'll take care of that vehicle and they'll make it run a lot longer than that it would in the States. They just find a way to continue to do that. So, but in the back of that truck was a combination communion table and baptistry, and communion set, communion cups. If they get stopped at the border for that, they're in for a big surprise, because it's not gonna be anything that they would normally confiscate. But we do want you to pray for that journey, because Christian husband is currently driving that truck across the country, and will cross the border with it hopefully Tuesday. Knowing him, it may be by tomorrow, but. We kept saying, when this was first discussed, there was an issue because the truck is a little bit older than what they'll normally allow into the country. And Christian said, "Hey, I know a guy at a border crossing, so we're going to spiritually keep our fingers crossed, but pray for his safety and for the journey that he's making, and that there'll not be any issue with getting a much-needed vehicle down there, but in addition, the supplies." And Tim and Leanne followed Tim to Memphis last night. Christian was supposed to land at 9. The plane got there at 10. And then Tim and Leanne drove back from Memphis last night. And Tim was here this morning to teach his class, and then he'll conduct the meeting after that. So our thanks to them for this level of service. So it's a very exciting time. We have new people that are going, and that kind of feeds into what we're going to talk about this morning, and that has to do with expectations. During the course of the summer, with vacation season and opportunities to travel, if it's something that you've really made long-term plans for, you build up a level of expectation. And then, of course, after you go on that trip, or after you go through that particular experience, you kind of have an opportunity to step back and weigh whether or not that met your expectations or not. And you can talk to children who go somewhere for the very first time, and you ask them, what was it like? What did you like the best? What do you remember about that? And it all has to do with expectations. I know you've read the story of the little girl who looked forward to seeing the ocean for the very first time, and her parents described to her how massive the water was and how blue and the waves. And when she stood there on the beach for the very first time, she looked at all that water and she said, it's not as big as I thought it would be. Well, there's a gap. There's a gap between expectation and experience. And if that doesn't line up, if that doesn't match up, then there's disillusionment. And if your favorite team finishes second in the conference, or second in the tournament, or second in the nation, that can be a great season. Or it can be a great disappointment, depending on what your expectations were or what your hopes are. And no matter how impressive an event, a trip, a vacation, no matter how impressive that may be, it is always appreciated in direct proportion to your anticipation of it. And I think that's why in our current series on marriage as God would have it, I think that's where many marriages fail because of unreasonable expectations. There's a cartoon, and I tried to find it through the course of this past week, but I couldn't find it. But she's seated across the desk from a marriage counselor, and she laments, "I was looking for the ideal, and I married an ordeal, and now I want a new deal." And I think one of the reasons so many people are disillusioned with marriage is that our anticipation of what marriage is going to be doesn't match up with the reality of it. And feelings are hurt and deprived, and people bail out or cheat on their mate, or they just go through life thinking that this is as good as it gets. Now, last week, we began this series by talking about the ideal. We went all the way back to the Garden of Eden, talked about Adam and Eve and the relationship that they had, and there were certain components that made their relationship what it needed to be. But then something happens. And we turn to that third chapter, and we begin to see that Satan steps in, and he establishes a pattern there in Eden that is in place even to this point in time. And he instills doubt, and he begins them to second guess not only themselves, but they begin to second guess God himself. And so these expectations then are not met with them, and we see the results of it. You know, in Luke chapter 14, Jesus told a story. He said, "Suppose one of you wants to build a tower." Now, that doesn't mean anything for us, but back then a tower was built on a piece of property because it was used for security purposes. A person would, if they had the means, they would put a servant or one of their older children in that tower to watch for any kind of danger or any kind of issue that might be negative for the family. And so Jesus says, suppose you want to build a tower, would you not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to finish it? Here's what he says. For if he lays the foundation and is not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule him, saying, this man began to build and he was not able to finish. And his point was, you make sure that you coordinate your expectations with reality. Know in advance what you're getting into so that you're not disillusioned and you're not embarrassed halfway through. Now, today we're going to identify and hopefully correct some of the most common misconceptions about marriage. And as we walk through these, you're going to say, well, boy, that's kind of dated. And it sounds that way, but as I look at this and as I talk to couples and we work through in a premarital setting, these expectations, some of these I continue to hear. And so I've kind of made a deal with myself, and that is I'll quit saying this. I'll quit saying it to you when people quit saying it to me. How about that? That makes sense? But there are some misconceptions, and I hope this will enable us to understand some of the complexities that are brought into this relationship. One of the unrealistic expectations or unreasonable expectations that people have is, number one, I will live happily ever after. Yeah, I will live happily ever after. One woman wrote, I thought he would make me happy. After all, that's what he said. Then when I wasn't happy all the time, I became miserable, resentful, and tried to force solutions. I think the main reason we believe that marriage is going to be a continual state of bliss is that we have such a shallow understanding of what the adhesive is that holds marriage together. And that, of course, is love. We as a culture, and to some degree as believers, we've been brainwashed with this idea that love is always something that you feel. And if we love each other for a lifetime, then we're always going to feel the same way, the same level. We're always going to feel good, and we're always going to be happy. I thought about putting some pictures up there of Cinderella and Snow White, but I didn't want to offend. But that picture is what people have in their mind. That there's always this happily ever after conclusion. And the romance novels and the movies that have happy endings with the couple embracing, saying, I love you, will you marry me? And then they have this elaborate ceremony, expensive reception, and take these exotic wedding trips. But when the infatuation wears off, people are left with this disillusionment and this unhappiness, and they'll say, all of that was for this? And they're not talking about the other person, they're talking about the relationship, right? People who have been married for a year, and I have heard people married less than 5 years will say some stupid things like, I guess I don't love that person anymore, or I don't think I ever have really been happy with them. But you know, love isn't just something you feel like will make you happily ever after. It's something you do. Now, emotion is involved. Emotion is part of the process, but there's a lot more than just feeling. It's the product of an action, not the source of it. You catch that? It's the product of an action, not the source of it. And you look through the text, and my favorite, the go-to chapter, of course, is 1 Corinthians 13, and I want you to notice that the entire chapter is great, but look specifically at what Paul says here, because notice in this one paragraph how much what Paul says has really nothing to do with feeling or emotion, but it has everything to do with action and attitude. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It doesn't boast. It's not proud. It's not rude. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. It never fails. And you know, you read that, and then you have to listen to people say, well, I just don't emotionally, I'm no longer emotionally attached to that person. No, they don't say that. They don't, because they know how shallow that sounds. They know it sounds superficial to say, I no longer have feelings for that other. No, they couch it in this idea of, well, I just don't love him anymore. And to quote the venerable Tina Turner, what's love got to do with it? In reality, really. Or I'm just not happy anymore. Well, what's happiness got to do with it? Because you see, the Bible says, do nothing out of selfish ambition. Consider yourselves more highly than yourself. You consider other people on a higher level. Philippians Chapter 2. You see, in the first place, it's really not about you. And we think about, okay, well, what about other people that are a part of this? In the second place, nobody is 100% happy all the time. People are 95% happy, or they're 40% happy, but nobody lives happily ever after. Totally. We don't. I mean, I'm very happy with my job, but I have to admit there's probably 15% of what I have to do that I don't enjoy. Well, that could vary. And I could look back over 20 plus years of ministry here and say, I could say, you know, I have to be honest, I've never really been happy here. Well, that's not going to resonate in any kind of accuracy, because nobody's ever totally happy with everything in their job. That's not true, by the way. I think that was a little subtle. Y'all just kind of went, okay, we can fix that. I know very few people who are not 100% happy with their body and the way they look. They like to be taller. They like to have more hair. Or they like, But you know what? Whether you want to be taller or younger, you live with it. But if you expected to live happily ever after in marriage, then there's the disillusionment. And consequently, I think that explains the disposable marriages that are so chronic in our culture. U.S. News and World Report had a headline, 14 years ago, Recipe for Wedded Bliss. The subtitle said, Lower Your Expectations. It was based on the review of a book, Surrendering to Marriage. The author was a lady by the name of Iris Krasnow, and she conducted about 300 interviews to see what binds couples together and what pushes them apart. And she writes, and this is another of those instances when the culture finally catches up to what the text has said for the last 2,000 years. Because she finally, her conclusion was, it's not this romantic, happily ever after message. It's more like this gritty, real video. So lower your expectations. Once you realize that sustained happiness is not something you should expect from marriage, then you can be happy. And I think we would agree with that. And yet, she has to do an extensive study and interview 300 couples in order to come to the conclusion that Paul has stated nearly 2,000 years ago. Now, I know we've talked about this before, and that is when you go through the text and you read the relational passages in the Bible, there's really not a whole lot said about happiness. There's more said about holiness. And if holiness is the goal, then get this, happiness is a gift that comes as a byproduct of doing the right thing for a prolonged period of time. Now let that kind of sink in. And I should have put that up on a slide, but failed to do so. Happiness is a gift that comes as a byproduct of doing the right thing for a prolonged period of time. And we've said before, if Jesus had waited until something waited for something to come along that would make him happy, then he certainly would have never gone to the cross. But he chose obedience over happiness. Hebrews 12 and verses 2 and 3. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you would not grow weary and lose heart. The truth is, in most marriages, people experience this inverted bell curve. You know what a bell curve looks like. And it's, happiness and fulfillment. And the happiness and fulfillment start at this level, and then it kind of drops, and it bottoms out, parents, when? Yeah, when your kids are teenagers. It bottoms out. And then it comes back up and resumes its original level when? When they leave home. Right? It's an inverted bell curve. But it's this, you look at a bit, business starts with a need, and then there's a vision, and vision is followed by enthusiasm and commitment and growth and prosperity, and then there's acceptance, and it's the same thing with a relationship. And the key is to recognize at the top of the curve, or the bottom of the curve, if you will, that you do something to kind of shock the system, to kind of bring it back up. And it's that way in marriage. And my point through this whole discussion is, though most marriages go through that inverted bell curve, you start at the top with this thrill of romance and infatuation, and then you begin to move into a deeper level of discovery and commitment, and then reality. and you stay with it long enough, and you work through those low points, and then you begin to build up to mutual experience and appreciation and admiration, and eventually you resume that level of what would constitute mature love. And so it's not that I'm going to always live happily ever after. Number two, and I long for the day when I'll quit hearing this one, I will change my mate after we're married. I'll change my mate after we're married. Now, one of the major contributing factors to this myth is our custom of dating. You realize that our understanding, our concept of dating is primarily a 20th century development. And when I mean 20th century, I mean go all the way back to before the Depression, and when people began to congregate in major cities because of industry and what brought us out of the Depression, the industrial wave that launches us, into preparation for World War II. And from a social science standpoint, our concept of dating is a little deceptive. The courtship process, I mean, when you're dating somebody, you put you do your best. You put your best behavior in place, and we mask our true selves sometimes when we're dating. We'll make false promises. We'll pretend to enjoy things that we don't really enjoy. And we'll do all these things, and then the thought is, okay, after we're married, it'll be different. Arj Barker said, I deserve to have somebody love me for whom I'm pretending to be. Another writer said, courtship is like the 100-yard dash. Anyone can keep his knees high and his arms pumping gloriously for that short sprint in the spotlight. But marriage is a marathon that reveals the true character of the runner. And this is why there's some good books out there. Josh Harris wrote a book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And in that book, he stated that we really, as Christians, needed to rethink the dating scene. And just really how the whole concept is a little bit convoluted. Because, see, the truth is, people don't change after they're married. And you could leave here, and I'd tell the young people or couples that aren't married yet, when you leave this morning, stop any married couple. You can spot them. They're easy to spot. And ask them how much did they change after they were married, because our temperament, our background, our differences are deeply ingrained in us, and it's not long before people get relaxed and they kind of revert back to the way they were. And we think, well, this is really not the person I married. Oh, yes, it is. And I tell young people this all the time, and young ladies, if you want to see what that guy you're dating is really like, don't pay attention to how he treats you. Look at how he treats his mother. Look at how he treats his sisters, because that's reality. And to young men, if you want to know how that girl or what that girl is really like, then see how she relates to her teachers or to her roommate or other people in relationships, because that is reality. The challenge you see when you get married is not to change the other person, but you adjust to and you tolerate, and then you are enhanced by those differences as the two become one, as we talked about that last week. This is why the Bible instructs us to be sure to marry somebody who shares your faith. And when Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 14, do not be yoked together with unbelievers, he's talking about people, an unbeliever there, he means somebody that is openly antagonistic to your faith. And if you enter into the most beautiful relationship kind of on opposite pages spiritually, then you're going to run into some problems, because and I hear all the explanations. I hear a lot of explanations. I hear a lot of promises that are made on the front end. But the interesting thing to me is in general, and I think in general, nowhere in the Bible are we to use dating or marriage as leverage for evangelism. Can I say that and not be misunderstood? There's no doubt that here's a Christian and they're dating an unbeliever, and because of their behavior and because of their example, it can bring about the conversion. There are countless examples of this, even in our gathering this morning, of people who were, person that wasn't a Christian when they first got together, when they first married, but then did at some point and on. But that's kind of an added blessing, and you don't use that as leverage for that. So don't be deceived into believing that they're just going to be significantly different after you're married. Okay, number 3, very quickly. Misconception number 3. Marriage is a 50-50 partnership and leadership will never be an issue. When I ask engaged couples, who's going to be the leader of this relationship? Well, there are roadblocks that are sometimes put up automatically because they'll say, well, we're going to share leadership. And it's usually the bride-to-be that'll say that. We're going to share leadership. It'll be a 50-50 partnership. And of course, I'll say, well, okay, what happens when you come to a disagreement if it's 50-50? Well, we'll just work things through. And that attitude, of course, is an end result of some of the cultural things that we're hearing, and that is that there ought to be an equality. And there is an equality in purpose. There is an equality in value in the relationship. But the reality is leadership is essential, and God has sanctioned that the husband is to lead. And, George read from Ephesians 5 a while ago, and it kind of prompted this, verse 23. And keep in mind the beginning verse of that entire paragraph, verse 21, Paul says, be submissive one to another, meaning there are times when the husband should submit to his wife. But from a leadership standpoint, verse 23, he says, the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. And notice that leadership is not lordship, because God qualifies this by saying, lead, how so? Lead as Christ led the church. One writer put it this way: what wife would have any difficulty submitting to a husband who thinks that he is her slave? Submission doesn't mean menial service. There's Beth Moore, one of the writes a lot of study curriculum. She said submission, women, is you ducking so God can hit your husband. Well, that's probably as good as any. But I hear people all the time resist this concept of leadership when it comes to the husband. And either the husband will relinquish that leadership role, or it can be taken. And if you have a moment, we're not going to do it this morning, but 1 Peter Chapter 3, Sarah is an example of a godly, strong, personality woman who followed and honored her husband. In fact, Peter says that the beauty of women, of godly women, is not dependent on her wardrobe or her jewelry, but it's dependent on an inner, beautiful disposition. And he goes on to say, you are her daughters if you do what's right. But then he says, and he kind of inverts it, because Peter says to husbands, you be considerate of your wives and treat them as partners with you. So if there's no designated leader, it's going to be this constant continued tug of war, if you will, as to who's really in charge. And there's a designated leader here, and we have to be mindful of that. Finally, number 4, my mate will meet all my needs. My mate will meet all of my needs. You know, and I don't agree with everything, but Willard Harley wrote a foundational work many years ago entitled His Needs, Her Needs. And I like it for the most part. There are a couple of things that I'm still trying to work through, but one of the great things that he did in that work was he identified the basic needs of men and women. And they're quite different, right? And his point is a failure to understand those differences contribute to a large level of dissatisfaction in marriage. He lists a woman's basic needs as affection, conversation, trust, financial security, and commitment to the family. And the top needs of men are quite different: sexual fulfillment, recreational companionship, domestic support, and admiration. And somewhere, I think his point is, somewhere we feel like that when we get married, I found the person who's going to meet all of those needs. And the woman thinks, well, I'll be valued and I'll be understood. And the man is thinking, I'll always have somebody with me and somebody who likes everything that I do. And one of the reasons for that misconception is we put all the pressure on one person to fulfill every need that we have. And the reality is that your spouse probably grew up in an environment and is expecting you to meet all of his or her needs, just like, you're expecting them. And the truth is, there's nobody in the entire world that can do that. And one of the issues, and I've kind of lost track necessarily with all of the approaches that a lot of the online dating websites are taking. And I think there's some really good ones out there. There are some that are, seem to be good for a chuckle more than anything else. But this idea that is, you go out and you find this one person, and you identify them as your soulmate or the person just right for you, and then you marry them. And I think that's backwards. I think you find someone who shares your faith, who completes you, and then you marry them, and then over the course of time, they become your soulmate. And you realize that there are so many things about that person that complete you, but to insist that one person fulfill all of your needs is way too much pressure, and the only person that can do that is whom? Is Jesus Christ. He is the only person that can meet all of your needs. And if you expect your mate to do that, then you're not only going to be disillusioned, but you're going to lean on that person so much that they're not going to be able to hold up. And if you expect to meet all of their needs, you're going to be possessive and you're going to be jealous of any other friendship that they might have, even if it's a relationship with God. But when we put God first, and this is where we're going next week, when we put God first, then He provides the understanding, He provides the security, He provides the peace and the unconditional love that define our own self-worth, and then we're better able to serve the person we marry. And this is why Jesus said, you seek the kingdom first, and what? Then all these other things will be added to you. So maybe in the days and the weeks to come, when you look out at your marriage, and there's there might be a little disillusionment. It's not as exciting. It's not what you thought it would be. But maybe your hopes were just a little unrealistic. And you need to get real. And maybe you need to have this perspective that there are depths that you've not yet plunged to, and then that there's a horizon that you may not have yet explored. And just maybe, if you work at it, the best is yet to be. We're going to close this morning by giving you an opportunity to respond to the kind of love and the kind of relationship that Jesus offers. Because you see, it's that relationship that mirrors marriage and what a husband and a wife need to be. And it's all predicated by an unconditional love that determines the expectations that we have and can have with Him. And if you're subject in any way, we would warmly receive you this morning if you come while together we stand and while we sing.